June 15th, 1608. The Arctic Ocean was calm, but only in the way a graveyard is calm. Henry Hudson's ship pushed through freezing black water beneath a sky so pale and lifeless it barely looked real. For days, the men aboard had seen nothing but ice, fog, and an endless stretch of ocean that seemed to go on forever. No birds, no nearby ships, no land, just cold wind, dark water, and the constant groaning of timber beneath their feet. By that point, the crew had every reason to be exhausted. They were searching for a route throughout the Arctic, forcing their way into waters few men had ever seen, and the conditions were brutal. Sleep was broken, tempers were short. The cold had settled into their bones, and like so many sailors before them, they were drifting through the kind of empty sea that had a habit of playing tricks on the mind. Then, one of the men looked over the side of the ship. At first, he thought he'd seen a body. Something pale had risen from the water beside them, just for a moment, before slipping back beneath the surface. The sailor froze, stared, then called for the others. A second crewman rushed over. Both men leaned over the railing, peering into the dark water below, and then it surfaced again. This time, it came close enough for them to see it clearly. According to the account later written down by Hudson's crew, the thing in the water wasn't thrashing, it wasn't drowning, it was watching them with her gaze. Its upper body, they said, looked like that of a woman. From the navel or belly button upward, it had pale skin, a human-like back, breasts, and long black hair hanging wet behind it. The skin was smooth, as if it was trying to lure someone. For a few seconds, it drifted beside the ship as if it were studying the men leaning over the edge. Then a wave rolled in. The creature tipped backward into the sea, and as it disappeared beneath the surface, the sailors caught one final glimpse of it. Not legs, not a body sinking straight down, but a tail. Long, dark, speckled, like that of a fish's scales, like some kind of sea creature stitched onto the torso of a human being. And then it was gone. No one aboard that ship could chase it. No one could prove what they had seen. All they could do was write it down, as they had no cameras in that time. And that's what makes this story so strange, because when most people think of mermaids, they think of beauty, mystery, fantasy, maybe even something harmless, something beautiful, magnificent. But for most of history, that's not what mermaids were at all. Long before they became symbols of beauty, mermaid-like creatures were warnings, omens, lures, things sailors feared seeing in the water, especially when they were far from land and even farther from help. And the men aboard Hudson's ship were not the only ones who claimed to see them. So tonight, we are going to get into the dark origins of mermaid legends. However, stories like that didn't begin with Henry Hudson. For thousands of years, cultures across the world told stories of human-like creatures in the sea, beautiful enough to draw sailors in, but unnatural enough to terrify them once they got too close. Today, when most people think of mermaids, they picture something magical, mysterious, maybe even harmless. But in older legends, mermaids were rarely harmless. They were omens, warnings, lures, creatures tied to shipwrecks, storms, and death at sea. When someone didn't come back, it was either a storm, or a siren, or a mermaid. And tonight, we're going to get into the dark origins of mermaid legends, from the sailors who claimed to see them, to the ancient stories that turned them into one of the ocean's most enduring nightmares. So let's get into it. The Henry Hudson account. One of the strangest mermaid sightings on record came in the summer of 1608. During an Arctic voyage led by the English explorer Henry Hudson. Hudson and his crew were deep in the northern Atlantic, pushing into freezing, unfamiliar waters in search of a route through the Arctic. It was the kind of journey that already felt cursed before anything supernatural ever entered the picture. There was endless fog, bitter cold, ice-filled water stretching in every direction they looked. Days of staring into an empty sea so still and lifeless that even the smallest disturbance could have stood out immediately. And that's exactly what happened. According to the account recorded by Hudson's crew, two sailors were standing aboard the ship when they noticed movement in the water nearby. At first, it may not have seemed like much, just another shape in the sea, maybe a drifting animal, maybe something half hidden beneath the surface. But as it drew closer, the men realized they were not looking at anything ordinary. What rose beside the ship, they claimed, looked human. Not fully human, not even close, but human enough to be deeply unsettling. They described the creature as having the upper body of a woman, pale skin, a human-like back, long hair trailing behind it in the water. It almost looked beautiful until you realize what it was. It surfaced near enough to the ship for the men to study it, and what made the encounter so eerie was how calm it seemed. It wasn't thrashing like an animal caught in rough water. It wasn't flailing or trying to escape. It simply drifted there beside the vessel, close enough to be seen clearly, as if it had surfaced on purpose. And for a few moments, it just watched them. Imagine that for a second. You're weeks into an Arctic expedition. You're cold, exhausted, maybe even nauseous, and you're surrounded by miles of black, freezing ocean. Then you lean over the side of the ship and find something in the water looking back at you. Something with the face and body of a person, but only from the waist up. You may think it's a dead person, or someone that's stuck in the water, but then you realize it's not a person at all. Then the creature rolled. As it slipped back beneath the surface, the sailors saw the lower half of its body, and whatever illusion of humanity it had vanished instantly. Instead of legs, they reported a tail, long, dark, and speckled, more like a porpoise than anything from a fairy tale. Its tail was kind of like a fish's scales, nothing like human lower body parts. In one motion, the thing disappeared back into the Arctic water and was gone. Nobody caught it. No one followed it. No one followed it. There was no second sighting that night. Just two men aboard a ship left staring into the sea after watching something they could not explain. And that is what makes Hudson's account so unsettling. Not because it proves the mermaids or sirens exist, but because it doesn't read like a fairy tale. It reads like the kind of things sailors would whisper about in the dark after seeing something they knew they were never supposed to see. Something that would bother them throughout the whole journey. Sirens, mermaids, and why sailors feared them. If Hudson's crew had been the only sailors to report something like that, the story would likely have died down with them, but it didn't. Because by the time Hudson's men claimed to see that figure in the Arctic water, stories of women in the sea had already been haunting sailors for centuries. Some of the oldest versions didn't even call them mermaids. They called them sirens, as I mentioned earlier. In the oldest Greek stories, sirens were not the fish-tailed creatures people imagine today. They were something stranger. Part woman, part bird. Creatures said to wait near the sea and lure sailors to their deaths with song. In Homer's Odyssey, they weren't described as beautiful guardians of the ocean. They were a trap, a voice in the distance promising safety, comfort, maybe even desire, something that the men on the ship were lacking, only to pull men toward destruction. And that darker idea never really disappeared. Over time, the image changed. The bird-like sirens of the ancient world slowly blended with later stories of women in the sea. And somewhere along the way, the monster perched on the rocks became the woman rising from the water. But the role stayed almost exactly the same. She was still a warning. She was still tied to death. And she was still waiting for sailors. By the medieval period, mermaids had become something deeply unsettling in European folklore. They weren't the bright, romantic figures modern stories would turn them into centuries later. They were creatures seen near storms, near shipwrecks, near the kind of lonely coastlines where bodies washed up and ships disappeared. Some stories claimed they sang to men from the rocks. Others said they simply appeared in the water before disaster struck, as if seeing one was itself an omen that something had already gone wrong. And once you start looking, that same pattern appears over and over again. Even if it wasn't really there, the sailors' minds would be lost. We must understand that they were isolated from everything. So even if somebody else saw it, or even if they saw it once themselves, they may have looked into the water and seen it again, but only from their imagination. Christopher Columbus, sailing near the Caribbean in 1493, claimed to have seen 3 mermaid-like figures rising from the water. But what makes his account so eerie is that he almost seemed disappointed by them. He wrote that they were not as beautiful as they were painted, that their faces looked more masculine than he expected, which is strange because that detail makes the story feel less like a fantasy and more like a glimpse of something uncanny, something human enough to recognize, but wrong enough to leave behind a sense of unease. That's what makes these stories so persistent, not just the beauty of the creature, but the fact that it never seems fully beautiful. It was never fully human, never fully safe, which is why our minds were so scared of them. Across different cultures, the details changed, but the feeling stayed the same. Sometimes mermaid-like beings were described as seducers, sometimes as omens, sometimes as sea spirits, sometimes as monsters, sometimes as something in between. But they almost always lived in the same place, at the edge of the known world, in the water beyond the shore where storms rose without warning and people vanished without explanation, isolated areas. And for sailors that mattered, because the ocean was already terrifying enough without monsters. Out there, far from land, a storm could erase a ship in minutes. Waterspouts were everywhere. Fog could swallow entire coastlines. Men could go days without proper sleep, without warmth, without water, and without food, and without knowing if they were even moving towards safety. In a place like that, you didn't need much for a legend to take hold. All it took was one strange shape in the water, one voice carried over the wind, one glimpse of something pale rising beside the ship. And suddenly, the old stories didn't feel like stories anymore. They felt possible. They felt real. So to get to the last part of this video, we wonder, what were these sailors actually seeing? That's the question that sits underneath almost every mermaid story told. Because as eerie as these accounts are, there are explanations for at least some of them, and not all of them are supernatural. One of the most common theories is that many sailors simply misidentified marine animals, manatees, dugongs, seals, creatures seen from a distance, in bad light, through fog, waves, exhaustion, and expectation. A man who had spent weeks at sea, half frozen, half starved, and running on broken sleep would not have been looking at the ocean with a clear mind. We must understand that hallucinations were common. And if he had grown up hearing stories about women in the sea, it wouldn't take much for a strange shape in the water to become something more than an animal. But even that explanation doesn't make the stories feel any less unsettling. Because what made mermaid legends so powerful was never just the creature itself. It was the setting. The open ocean is one of the few places on Earth where a human being can feel completely erased. No roads, no lights, no landmarks, nothing. Just black water stretching in every direction, and the constant feeling that if something rose out of the sea beside you, there would be nowhere to run. And that's why these stories survived. Not because every sailor was lying, not because every sighting was real, but because the ocean was already a place. But because the ocean was already a place where the impossible felt possible. A storm could appear out of nowhere. A ship could vanish without leaving a single body behind. Men could hear voices in the wind, see shapes in the fog, and watch the water long enough to start believing it was watching them back. Maybe some mermaid sightings were nothing more than fear, loneliness, and the sea playing tricks on exhausted minds. But maybe that still fully doesn't explain why cultures across the world kept imagining the same kind of creature. Something human enough to approach, but unnatural enough to fear. Something beautiful enough to lure you closer, and strange enough to make you wish you hadn't looked at all. Now, whether mermaids were ever real creatures, misunderstood animals, or just stories born from fear and the sea itself, one thing is certain. For most of history, they were never the harmless fantasy we imagine today. They were warnings. They were omens. And to the sailors who swore they saw them rising from the water, they were something far worse than a myth. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know what story you want to see next down in the comments. And until next time, this has been Archivum Obscura.